Hello, this is Ed Stetzer, and I'm actually moved up from the normal location where we shoot from a basement in Aurora, Illinois. But I'm still a motivational speaker who lives in a van down by the river, and happy to be here today. You may have noticed that my voice is a little different. I've actually got myself some cherry cough drops today, and making it through. Of course, generic brand, but nonetheless, getting me through the day. And but we're still excited to be here. We're actually shooting from a different location because we had a shoot earlier today, another live shoot here at Lifeway. So I'm actually in the hallway at Lifeway. So if you see me walk by, and you just don't be surprised by that. But we're having a good time unpacking that. Matter of fact, you look in the distance, if you look over my shoulder, this shoulder right here, you can see J.M. Frost. He was the founding president of, what they call him a corresponding secretary back in the day, the founding president of Lifeway. And so there you go. So very famous hallway we're in right this very moment. So it might give us a little special ambiance, perhaps some gravitas as we jump in today. But we're going to talk today about the issue of church revitalization. As always, we're going to have discussion a little later on in our session, but we're going to talk about church revitalization because this is an incredibly common question that I get asked, is how do we see church revitalization? What does it look like when church revitalization takes place? And so I'm excited to be able to share about this because my own background is actually church planting. I got into church revitalization later because I was actually a seminary professor when I got a phone call from a church in a kind of a outlying area, not outlying, kind of a suburb of the city where I was serving at seminary. And they said, they called me Dr. Stetzer, would you help us come reach the young people? And what they meant by the young people was the community. It was an older church. The median age was actually 68 years of age. And so what we did is we began to look and ask the question, how could we apply some of these principles where we may be seen in church planting, which was my background. At the time I had planted churches in New York and Pennsylvania, and I was teaching church planting and evangelism. How could we see these principles into church revitalization? Now, I want you to know that church revitalization is, I think it's more difficult. I think that church revitalization is harder than church planting. And church planting's hard, but the reason I think it's harder, well, I think it was Bill Easom who once said that, it's always easier to raise the dead. To have a baby than to raise the dead. And so there's a certain sense that church planting is an easier task, and church revitalization is difficult. So we had the privilege of walking this journey through a church in Indiana, right across the river there in Louisville. And then also some subsequent ones. And that's actually talked about in the book I co-authored with Mike Dodson called Comeback Churches. And Mike did all the work. Actually, he did his doctoral dissertation on the research here. But I'm going to talk some about that. And I'm just going to kind of unpack a PowerPoint that'll share some of the things about church revitalization and help us to think about the issue. And maybe that's where you are. Now, if you have questions, you can start sharing some of them. And we've got a chat room open. Make sure you go to lifeway.com/the exchange, and you can log into the chat room right there. And if you're watching live, and we'll be able to answer some of those questions. It's okay to put them in now. We'll pick some out as we go, and you can start the discussion and dialogue. Also, feel free to share your opinion, your own experiences. One of the things we found is the chat room is less about often asking questions than it is about engaging in dialogue. So let's talk some about church revitalization. You can see here that this is what we're talking about is the issue of comeback churches. Comeback churches is the theme that we're going to look at today. And one of the questions people often ask me is, why study comeback churches? Why take the time to go through and learn? Well, here's some things. One of the reasons is that we found the statistics on church revitalization were pretty concerning to us. Many churches are flat to declining. We wanted to help churches come back after a period of decline, but we wanted to use biblical principles. It wasn't just here's 5 things churches did and numerically it turned them around. But the fundamental issue for us on studying comeback churches was we wanted to learn from the experience of others. One of the things that we determined was helpful was that if you want to learn how to do something, the best way maybe to do it is to ask people who've done it. And so what we did is we actually studied and surveyed 324 churches, really to get to this big question. What principles from comeback churches could guide pastors and churches down the path of revitalization? So what we did is we actually asked them, rather than just simply saying, how would we guess this? We could make our own lists of guess. I'm guessing you could come up with some as well. But we looked at the question of what others had done already. Now, the obvious question is how do you get through this process? How do you consider this level of change? Well, here, let me tell you how the study method went. Here's what we did. We examined 324 churches that experienced growth after a period of decline, and that they had to have both increased membership and increased baptisms. In other words, we weren't just looking for churches that had swapped sheep with other churches, but they actually had experienced some transformation through conversion. And here's the survey method. We used surveys and phone interviews. Remember, 324 churches talked about it. And then here was our criteria. They had to experience at least 5 years of plateau, followed by significant growth between 2 to 5 years, and then have a membership to baptism ratio of 35-1. Now, I'm going through this fast, and you can actually download this PowerPoint at comebackchurches.com. It's free. Feel free to download it. But why we did all this was to get a picture of the situation of churches that experience revitalization. So we called these churches sometimes 3 times. I think 75 of them got 3 calls. And Mike and I and our team would make these phone calls and really survey and dig in with these churches, because we found that there are some differences. Some of you asked some good questions already. How do you know the difference between a church that needs to be revitalized or replanted? That's one of the issues we looked at. We looked at where they were and what measure of change that they found necessary and what they needed. And so, but let me talk some about the criteria of how we went about the criteria to determine whether or not they could be in our study. A couple things. Again, they had to be plateaued for a while. Think of a flat or a declining church for at least 5 years. Here's why. We didn't want a church that was doing well for 5 years, had a bad year, and then had 3 good years. Say, well, that's a revitalized church. No, just had a bad year. And so we're looking for churches that were really experiencing some issues. They were stuck and stagnant for a while. And then they had to have experienced growth through conversion for at least 2, but no more than 5 years. Now you say, well, Ed, don't you want churches growing more than 10 years? Sure. But if you think back, probably you don't remember a lot of what you did 10 years ago. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to be new enough in their recollection that they could tell you what they did, but we didn't just want 1 year, we wanted at least 2 years. So we had to have 2 to 5 years of growth through conversion. And we did that by a membership to baptism ratio of 35-1. So in other words, if you had 100 members of your church, you would expect to see at least three baptisms that came out of that. Now, not all the groups participated were credo Baptists, like I am. In other words, some not all of them practice baptism by immersion following conversion, as I do in my church. And so, in the case of those groups, what we did is we did conversions for them. But either way, we were looking for, in my tradition, we measure conversions best through baptisms, people being obedient and following through in baptism, believers' baptism. So we were looking for those that had experienced growth through conversion, at least 10% per year in the years of the study, and then focusing in on what they did to get a picture of it. Now, let me say that when we wrote Comeback Churches, we didn't just start by saying, well, here's what the numbers say. Part of my concern is in church research is that sometimes we get caught up in methodological mania. We think that if we just do these 5 things and these 4 things will happen and I'll multiply by 3 and then I'll lead to 12 things. No, it's more than that. And it requires a view of church. And so what we did in the book is actually we have what we call chapter 0. And we kind of laid out some things that we think are essential for every church and every time that should be present. Things like scriptural authority, biblical leadership, preaching and teaching, ordinances, covenant community, and mission. We call these marks of a biblical church. And so when we look at churches, and these were churches from 11 different denominations, we want to make sure they had the marks of biblical churches, because we weren't just looking to come up with some statistical magic, but instead we wanted to see churches that were experiencing transformation, but they were biblical churches. Excuse me. And so we began to get a feel for what took place in those churches from a biblical perspective, but that wasn't the totality of it as well. We also want to look at the issue of, were they churches that were living on mission, and how were they expressing mission in their context? So to do that, we talked about them being missional churches. And as we looked at these missional churches, I'll give you some things here about being a missional church. They had joined God in His mission. They existed for that purpose. They studied and learned the language. They proclaimed the good news of the gospel. They were the presence of Christ, and they sought to contextualize biblical life and church for that culture. Those were key issues for us as we got a picture of what it meant to be an on-mission and a mission-based church. And so also they were biblical, they were missional, but another issue is these were spiritual issues. The issues of transformation are spiritual issues. So let me walk through with you some of the spiritual issues that we saw and that we learned as we kind of went down this journey of church revitalization to understand it. I think it might help us to get a picture of these things as we look through them together. Let's take a look. First of all, We found that sometimes churches didn't grow because of a spiritual hindrance, that they had self-focused leaders in churches. When it's all about you, it's not about joining God in his mission. It's not about the focus of revitalization. Another issue is sometimes churches were just experiencing God's discipline. There were and are times when a church has, because of some sin in the church, and we see pictures of this in the scripture, because of some sin in the church, God is disciplining that church and not sending new people to that church. Sometimes a spiritual issue is the lack of radical faith or reliance. Recently, I spoke to a group of folks trying to bring revitalization to mainline churches in Chicago, and part of the Association of Church Renewal. And one of the things that they talked about is that you can get on a financial endowment of a church. And so what you end up doing is you just live off of the finances of people in the past, of God's faithfulness in the past. And that can often lead to a lack of radical faith or reliance. Another issue often in spiritual hindrance to church is doing instead of being the church. In other words, just going through the motions because that's how it's always been done, and so we continue to do that rather than actually living on mission as church. Sometimes the issue is watering down the gospel and the truth. Now, I'm not unaware that there are sometimes churches that can and do grow that have watered down the gospel and the truth. But I think that we need to also note, kind of tied into the idea of God's discipline, that watering down the gospel and the truth is an issue in some churches that are not faithfully proclaiming the gospel, and therefore that becomes a spiritual barrier for them. Another issue is we can get distracted from our first love. How do we stay focused on that? Sometimes it's ineffective discipleship making. The disciple making, the elephant in evangelicalism is that we're not making a lot of robust disciples, and the need to do that. Sometimes it's irrelevant ministry. I've often said in my own denominational family, and it's true in so many other places, but if the 50s come back, many of our churches are ready to go. Well, sometimes we hold the truths of Scripture. We're following Christ, but we're not caring enough to engage our community in relevant and meaningful ways. And lastly, sometimes it's just an issue of pride. There are times and there are contexts where we're just too prideful to understand what it means to bring people along. So how do we get there? Excuse me. Well, let me talk about some of what we found along the way. And I apologize for the cough. I was hoping to make it through without being a distraction to you, but those cough drops are not winning the day. And so maybe I'll put 3 or 4 in and continue to try that. But the question then becomes is why then walk that journey and seek to live out church revitalization? Why become a comeback church? Well, for me, one of the things that I found along the journey was that it took a while for a church to get to the place where they're ready to make the decisions necessary. So we walked this journey at this church I mentioned outside of Louisville, Kentucky for a long time. We actually, one of the things we did, we went door to door into the neighborhood and kind of see who was in the neighborhood. We listened and learned from other churches to see what we could understand about how they were experiencing church revitalization. And I remember one night we had a meeting and we gathered everyone together on a Wednesday night. Because as you know, in the Bible, it says you have to have church on Wednesday night and second opinions. And so we gathered together, and when we did, we had a discussion of what are we going to do? And there were all kinds of ideas. Remember, the median age of this group of 35 senior adults was 68 years of age. There was all kinds of ideas. And I actually put out a chart, and I charted out the church was founded in the 50s, and I charted out that at the current rate, the church would kind of pass the zero barrier. In other words, would cease to exist not that far into the future. And so what happened was the chairman of deacons, a wonderful man, stood up and he kind of got it. When he spoke, everyone listened, and he stood up and he said this phrase. He said, "We don't want our church to die. We'll do what it takes." And when they were willing to do that, we began to see the changes begin to come, that transformation begin to experience. Now, my guess is that many of you watching right now, you're as a pastor or church leader, you're ready to say, we don't want our church to die. We'll do what it takes. But one of the questions already on the screen here is, do you have any tips for how to bring along church members who are opposed to change? Yes. And that's what we're going to talk about right now, is how to bring that change along. That's what we're going to spend most of our time talking about here. Matter of fact, let me put up a chart that kind of gives you a picture of change and how change is necessary along the way. We recognize that there's a different level of change that's needed based upon the situation. If you start at the bottom of the chart, there's a lot of change needed. Some churches just need restarting. Needs to be restarted with a new leadership, become a new church. It's too far gone. And it doesn't mean God's not going to use the facilities, but we need to be very careful that the God's heart and passion is not that we might save buildings, but that we might have people join him on his mission. And so it's essential for us to get that. And so at the very bottom, the more change is required. The worse the situation is, the more change is required. And often, the more willing people are to make that change. Now, the tricky part is when you're sort of in that middle section, where you know you need a lot of change, but the people don't think you need a lot of change. So the question then becomes is how do you help them to see the necessity of that change? And that's what we're going to talk about. Let me talk about that some and just sort of walk through some of the challenge that's here for us to see, because there are some ways that churches begin to think, and I want you to think about, and maybe you need to identify your own church as one of the things that Mike and I talk about in the book is the Dirty Baker's Dozen. We looked for 13 examples of the way churches can sometimes get distracted, and let me see if there are some of maybe your situation might be reflected here, okay? One is there's the institutionalized church. It's the idea here is that the church it's existed because it does. Some churches are more passionate about their existence than they are about joining God on mission. This church has everything in its place. There's 52 committees for anything. Now this is a lot of times how we inherit the church. We just kind of inherit that. Sometimes we bring it ourselves. When I planted my first church, I didn't know particularly any better. And so when I planted my first church, we had 9 people come to our first service at the very first church I planted when I was 21. And well, actually we had more than we had 21, but they were well-wishers from the association, our district, things of that sort. And so what we did is we kind of shared our constitution. We had a 32-page constitution for a 9-person attendance church. Why? Because we were just inheriting that institutionalization along the way. And so for us, that was a key issue. So if your church is institutionalized, the challenge is it needs to move beyond that into mission. And secondly is the voluntary association church. Now, when we talk about a voluntary association church, we're talking about many churches just exist because it's like the Rotary Club or the Lions Club or the Elks Club. Just a group of people who get together, and there's this Wednesday night gathering maybe where they share their needs, and the Sunday morning event where they experience some community. But at the end of the day, it's just a voluntary association of individuals. Third thing is the unintentional church. This is the church that just sort of exists. It's there because it's always been there. You ask, why do you exist? Well, because we existed last year. The us for and no more. This is the church that often has key leader or leaders who don't want new people to come and to be a part of it. We also see the we can't compete church. Wow, there's a little PowerPoint graphic there. That was pretty 1997. But the we can't compete church is kind of feeling like it can't keep up with the large church around it. And part of the challenge is that it talks itself out of effective mission and ministry. The decently and in order church. This is the idea of the only verse they know from 1 Corinthians is that all things should be done decently and in order. But there are others. Maybe you can see yourself in the square peg in a round hole. I've seen many churches and communities that have changed. I'm thinking of one particular church where the community has transitioned into a complete Latino community, and they're a predominantly Anglo church. They're a square peg in a round hole. Sometimes it's the time warp. We talked some about irrelevant ministry before. The tidy church, where their main concern is it looking nice rather than it being on mission. I'll tell you, when you reach lost people, sometimes it can be messy. The my way or the highway. The chaplaincy is another common one. The chaplaincy one is the idea that the church hires you. Many of you are pastors who are watching, and your job is just basically take care of them. The company church is the one that just asks the question, what's the denomination want me to do today? And that's what I plug in and that's what I do. So it's driven by the denominational calendar rather than by the mission in its community. And lastly, the church that won't take risks. It's the play it safe church. So what then do you do? Well, that's the big issue. What then do you do? How do you experience a church revitalization comeback where you are? Now, let's define it to make sure we're talking about the right things here, okay? We're not talking about generally restarting, taking a building, okay? And I don't know that restarting is much different than starting. Restarting is basically you're starting with a legacy that somebody has given you because their church is closed. Now, again, let me mention restarting just for a moment, because I don't want to confuse the two. Restarting is good. As a matter of fact, we need a strategy in most denominations for restarting. And I'm asked about this a lot, is that we need a way to say to churches that are near death, because a lot of people think that if their church dies, they've actually betrayed the gospel. as if the gates of hell have prevailed. No, it just means that another group of people may be using the facility that God lets you use for a while. The building is not the same as a church. So if that church closes, what a legacy, what a way to pass it on and to say, you know what, the community's transitioned. We now live 15, 20, 30 miles away. It's a Latino community now, or maybe it's a predominantly Anglo community now. Maybe it's so changed in other ways, and we just don't live there anymore. Let's give birth to a new church. And part of the problem is that most denominations lack the courage to create ministries that would sort of go in and say to churches, you know what, you're kind of near death, and why don't we use your building for something other? So it's kind of a fear issue. My denomination doesn't have a denominational hierarchy or structure of that sort, so they can't go in and say, well, we need to use this facility for something else. But what we need is to teach people of all different kinds of churches that one of the great ways they can be a minister in their community is to, sometimes a church is just stuck and stagnant, needs to close down and let another church start back up in it. But that's not our focus here today. Our focus here today is 324 churches that were stuck and stagnant, didn't close, but made a transition. And that transition almost always involves new leadership. Let's talk about leadership for just a minute, because when we did the research, Mike Dodson and I, one of the things we were kind of not wanting to find was that everything rises and falls on leadership. You know, we kind of were writing this in a season when there were so many leadership cliches, and they always rhyme. You know, you can't have the dream unless you have the team. Well, good and fine, but we were kind of hoping that we'd find some sort of external spiritual element, some supernatural intervention. And you know what we found? We did find that leadership was not only a key, but the number one most commonly mentioned issue that when we surveyed the churches, the pastors of the churches. And I think part of the reason is that all of those things are true. There were cathartic moments when God worked in a powerful way. Matter of fact, we talked to some about the catharsis issue in transformational church. It became a key issue later on in transformational church. But there were cathartic moments that were there. There were transformations that were there. But in those cases, leaders were involved. So you're a leader, and I want us to be very careful. Right now, we're sort of in a season in the church where we're kind of down on leadership, and I really don't want us to be. I want us to recognize that 1 Timothy 3 says that this overseer role is a noble task. And so what we found is, as we kind of looked, there's two things that kind of caught my attention. Number one is that about 60% of these churches in the Comeback Churches study, about 60% of the churches in the study of the 324 that we talked to, they actually experienced their revitalization after a new pastor came. Now, I don't want to discourage you with that, because you might be thinking, well, I'm the pastor, I don't want to go. Well, but what we found is that this was a very common experience, that what happened was a new pastor came, that was part of the revitalization process. But that caught our interest, because the answer can't be simply, changing leaders. So we wanted to know what was different about the 40% or so who did not experience new leadership shift. And so we talked to them. Remember, I said at the beginning, we surveyed 324, some of them 3 times. Well, many of the third-time people, we came back to them a second time, and then a third time. Many of the third-time people, the reason we talked to them was because they were the same pastor before and after. Tom Rainer had written a book on breakout churches where he studied those who were the same pastor during a time when they were good, but then there was some sort of breakthrough. They went to great under the same pastor. So we wanted to ask, what was it about these 100 or so who were the same pastor when it was declining, but now the church was growing? And here's what we found, a recurring theme. It's really interesting. When we talked to the pastors, what they said was, well, we had a new leader. It was just me. In other words, they reported that they experienced a change of sorts, and there was often some sort of cathartic thing. We unpacked this more in transformational church. There was often some sort of cathartic change that took place. Maybe somehow the pastor had to step up and lead. Maybe there was a crisis. Maybe there was a difficult conflict in the church. That was not the only time. That happened more than once. And in doing so, the end result was new leaders stepped up. So let me share with you 3 principles that we saw, and then we'll just kind of open it up for discussion and dialogue as we go through. Here are the 3 principles that we saw. First is that anytime you go through this, the people have to be part of the turnaround. They have to be a part of the turnaround. You can't, now I recognize that all kinds of denominational traditions watch this, and not all of you are from a congregational tradition like I am. But I'm telling you that when it comes to church revitalization, everyone's congregational. You can't force congregational revitalization on a people. You have to lead them, and they vote with their feet. And we see the conflict in Acts chapter 6 and how they deal with it. They said, choose from amongst yourselves. And so what happened is that the end result is they were part of the solution, which we also see in Nehemiah. The necessity of deciding on a course of action. One of the things I did when I led this one church through, and actually I guess went to three subsequent churches, 4 total, that I've led through a revitalization process, every time I made them go on record as saying, we're agreeing to do this together. And the way we often did it, we actually often did votes, or we had a congregational meeting, said, do you want to do this? Now, not everyone's going to be happy. Pastor, listen, if you're a pastor and a church leader and 10% of the church is not mad at you, you are not trying hard enough. That's just normal to have people not happy with you. Now, if 60% of the people are mad at you, maybe you're pushing too hard. And so you want to recognize that part of it is you're going to have to push people to make change, but they need to make the change. They need to be a part of that decision-making process. We see that in Nehemiah. But ultimately, it's an issue of proactive leadership. Again, it's a noble task to be an overseer, a noble thing for us to see. So what we saw is comeback leaders taking the initiative for change. They like challenged excuses. Maybe it's become okay too long for your church to say it's okay as it is. And so the necessity of challenging excuses and saying, you know what, look at this. If we chart out where we're going to be, where we've been in the last 50 years and where we're going in the next 20 years, it's ultimately to extinction. Challenge excuses. Point people to the harvest. Say, look and see the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. But ultimately, it will require some change for people to experience that. Model yourself evangelistic passion. If you're a pastor, let me just tell you, you want to lead a church to revitalization, you cannot lead what you do not live. That's essential for all of us to understand. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think you have to help your church to see the need and to have the passion to care for its community more than its preferences. And that's not always the easiest thing. It'll require a change in the way you do things and a change in the way the church will do things. Now, I want to close and then open up the questions, but I want to close by showing you my shoe. Now, stay with me. That's a little weird, but there's a reason for that. Here's my shoe. Right now, I didn't tell them this here right now, but I'm going to show you my shoe because I have funny shaped feet. I just have to confess to you. My feet they're not webbed. I'm not Aquaman or anything like that, but my feet have on both sides of my feet a bone that sticks out right there. And you might be able to see it right there if you kind of zoom in, maybe be able to see it a little bit. But on this spot right there is that on both sides of my feet, when I get new shoes, they will actually it'll actually bleed for a while. I'll get blisters here and need Band-Aids and all that kind of stuff right in that spot right there. And so I've actually had a doctor offer to snip that off, which didn't sound like an attractive thing. And so I'll wear these shoes till they just fall off my feet, because of that spot right there. I can get the heel replaced, but I buy 2 cheap shoes to get the sole replaced. And so what happened is, you can already start seeing it. My hole's already here. Is that I'll get a quarter size hole in the spring, and then 3/4 in the summer, and then basically in fall I'm walking on sock basically. And so what happens is that I'll wear the same shoes until they wear off my feet. And then I'll be walking outside one day, and I won't see a puddle, and I'll step in the puddle. And there'll be holes in my shoes, right? As a matter of fact, I noticed this just recently, is that I actually have already the hole in this shoe ready to go right there. And so I am prepared for this. Now my wife's telling me, get new shoes, but it hurts. It hurts to get new shoes. So I'll wear these same shoes for as long as possible. Then the winter will come, and I will ultimately have I'll walk out into a frozen puddle, and the ice water will shoot up between my toes, and it'll hurt, and I'll get new shoes. Why then? Well, here's the principle. Because that frozen water gets in there and stays in there and hurts. Here's the principle. People never change until the pain of staying the same grows greater than the pain of change. So when you talk about church revitalization, you've got a church that's working real hard to get comfortable in its shoe. And it's been that way for a long time. And so it's going to have to, there's going to be pain that comes with change. As a leader, it's your job, to be a pain, maybe in a sense, but to help them hurt for the right things. Like when Jesus looked at the city of Jerusalem, he wept, for they were like sheep without a shepherd. They hurt for that. Too many churches hurt for their preferences rather than having a passion for their mission. But if you can lead them to that, that'll change your heart. Remember, you can't lead what you do not live. That'll change your heart, but then it'll change the heart of your church to be more about the mission of God. I just believe in the established church. I fell in love at that church in Indiana with with senior adults and with stuck and stagnant churches. We had the privilege of walking through a journey together that really just revitalized the church and saw God do some wonderful and powerful things. So my encouragement to you is not to give up, but to walk discerningly, to see your church transformed by the power of the gospel and to lead people to the change that's necessary. So let's have a little dialogue. Let's answer some questions and have some discussion about what we might learn about this. And we'll go to the chat room now and see what's out there. One of the questions is, do you have any stats on churches that attempted revitalization through merging with another church? Is this encouraged or to be avoided? We actually have. And we've done some research in partnership with a couple of organizations, and one of the things we found is that mergers are very infrequently done, so there's not a lot of data on the issue. My experience has been, so we can't say definitively merging will do this or that, but my experience has been is that most mergers tend to struggle because of the lack of common direction and leadership, and often you take two unhealthy bodies, and what the end result is not one healthy body. I think a better situation generally is less of a merger. A merger, I think, of two equal organizations coming together, and more of a one becoming into the other organization, where there's leadership. Sometimes one can be larger than the other, but the assumption is that this is the leadership team that's going to be in place, and therefore we become part of that leadership, rather than simply us creating a mix and try to say, well, you be in charge of this and you be in charge of that. I think that's a key issue. Another question is, how can we determine between preferences and true priorities? Well, I think the scriptures give us the direction we need there. Jude 3 tells us to contend earnestly for the faith once delivered to the saints. Preferences don't include our view of the authority of Scripture, our understanding of biblical offices, but preferences do include the kind of music that we have, the time that we meet, maybe even the kind of small groups that we gather. I think one of the challenges, and we talk about this in Breaking the Missional Code, is that you never want to remove the stumbling block of the cross, but I think the missional church seeks to remove as many other stumbling blocks as are possible. My experience has been is that most churches, they'll fight to the death over their preferences while their community is dying and going to hell around them. And so I think the necessity is for us to help them to care more about God, His mission, and the people around them than the way they like to do church. I'm actually convinced that you could show up and preach heresy at most churches in North America, and if you had a video clip and you were funny, they'd invite you back the next week. But if you changed the order of service, if you moved some of the furniture on the stage, you might want to have the U-Haul running in the back to get out of town in time. And so I think that just shows a real priority mix and problematic. What people say, well, we want to stand for something. Well, often the way they stand for is what they want in church rather than the gospel of Jesus Christ and the necessity of living on mission. I think a book that helps with that, particularly when I'm leading people through a church revitalization, is a newer book. It's by Gordon MacDonald. It's called Who Stole My Church? And it's a helpful book that helps people to look at, that part of it is church can't be about me. I got to give it up being about me and instead join God on His mission and move forward together as a church and as a body. One of the questions is, do you have tips for helping people get on board with the vision, specifically senior adults? A great question. Let me say, Pastor, this is important to many of you pastors. Senior adults are not a problem. You got to make them your partners. They might not like everything, and the reality is church is not going to look like the way often they remembered it. I get that, right? But, I'm 43. And I've noticed the church has changed a lot just in the last few years. I could cling to, and I've actually seen a lot of churches do, kind of cling to that 80s worship sound that I grew up in. And yet the necessity of recognizing that cultural forms and biblical meanings are not the same thing. I think if you take the time to love senior adults, to honor senior adults, and to teach them about why we're doing and why we're engaging in mission, I think the end result is that they'll be partners. Now, again, they might not agree with everything you say, but Pastor, listen, disagreeing with you is not the same as disagreeing with God. And the issue is to help people to think biblically and discerningly about the mission. When I left that church, I served in Indiana after 2 years, I went down transferred to the North American Mission Board in Alpharetta, Georgia. The guy I mentioned at the beginning came up to me at the last day and he poked me in the chest and said, "Preacher," called me preacher. He said, "I still don't like the music." He said, "The kids are breaking everything in the church." But he said something pretty profound. He said, still finger in my chest, he said, "But it was worth it all." But it was worth it all. And so my encouragement is to help cast a vision and to bring senior adults along as partners, not seeing them as problems, not someone to be shuffled aside, but to see them as partners along the way. Great question is, do you have an average to the amount of time a church takes to go from declining to growing? And you've probably heard the rule, don't make any change for the first year. People often always ask me that. Is that true? Here's what I would say. It depends on the church. If you go into a situation that's in trouble and you don't make any change for a year, I think you've probably made a poor decision. I think depending upon the degree of trouble or decline or even desperation really shapes the amount of change that you can and cannot make. So, give an example. I recently was serving the interim pastor of a church here in the Nashville area, and within the first, about the first week I was there, we actually eliminated 23 part-time positions. And that's a lot of positions, it's a large church. Why? Because of where we were financially. So I couldn't wait. Now I had to lead by example. I actually eliminated my own position. So I served in that role as a volunteer because I couldn't eliminate all these others. And matter of fact, of those positions, I actually asked them to stay on. They were part-time positions like mine. I was a part-time interim. I asked them to stay on as volunteers like I was, and 19 of them did. And so, I couldn't wait a year. We were at really a brink of great financial difficulty. And so we had to make decisions. So what I would say is that you can make decisions quickly if the will is there and the openness and the desire for that change is there. And I call it, you have a credibility tank. And when you're in the middle of a crisis, you've got a pretty full tank if they're bringing you in to fix it. But if it's not in the middle of a crisis and people have been declining for 20 years and they're comfortable with it, then you don't have the credibility to make a lot of changes. So it takes time to build up that credibility. We actually have a little diagram that we talk about the credibility tank being full and things of that sort. Well, good. Let me do one more question, and then we'll wrap it up here at the Exchange. The question is, why aren't there church revitalization networks like church planting networks? And I'm going to tell you why. Because church revitalization doesn't work as frequently as church planting does. So church planting networks, new churches are birthed, they then multiply, there are other churches, and they form together in teams. Church revitalization is harder work, and what I would say is it doesn't happen as frequently. Now, there are some resources that are out there, and different denominations have tools that have been helpful. We actually have, one of the things we're working here at Lifeway is through the transformational church process. If you go to transformationalchurch.com, we actually have a tool that you can use to help you walk through a church revitalization process, help you to think and actually survey your whole congregation of where are they on what we call the transformational church framework. So you can see that, and then we've got some coaching and some consulting that can help you with that. But what happens is that because church revitalization is hard, everyone says, well, let's just do it. I often hear, well, why don't we just treat church revitalization like we do church planting? Well, as someone who loves church planting, right? I've written couple books on the subject. I can tell you there are some areas that are similar, but there are a lot of areas that are just different. And it takes a different type of pastor to plant a church. There's some gifting that's there that's different than the type of gifting generally for church revitalization. I've fallen in love with both. I think we need both, but there may be different kinds of pastors who are engaged in both. And so what I would encourage you to do is, if you're a church revitalization pastor, maybe you've successfully led a church through church revitalization, is coach some others along the way. If you've coached through and maybe made it through the other side, bring some people who are just starting along in the journey and say, I'll help you and I'll encourage you on that journey as well. I'm a real believer in church revitalization. I'm a believer in the established churches. There are hundreds of thousands of churches, established churches in North America. They're stuck and stagnant, but they're often filled with people who love Jesus and who just need to know how. And so my hope is that you will take the time as a leader, because most people watch this are church leaders or pastors, you'll take the time as a leader to learn all you can about church revitalization. Read books like Breakout Churches by Tom Rainer, or Second Resurrection by Bill Easom, or other books of that sort, Turnaround Churches. Others, Comeback Church is a book that Mike and I wrote. Learn all that you can. Help take your leadership through that. One of the tools, again, I'd suggest you take your leadership through Transformational Church. Help them getting them all thinking on the same page with a common paradigm of how we might think through these issues. Because my prayer is that the name and fame of Christ will be more widely known through revitalized churches throughout North America. Thanks for joining us again on The Exchange. You can find these broadcasts archived at edstetzer.com. There's a link there at the top that says The Exchange, also lifeway.com/The Exchange. I mentioned comebackchurches.com. You can go back there. And also let me direct you to transformationalchurch.com. Again, thank you for joining us on the stage. We'll see you next time at The Exchange.